thank you very much for your time. We had really excellent discussions. It makes my life much easier. I feel like some of the results you're going to see is vindicated by presentations that were given this morning. And a lot of there is two groups of activities, I think, research that are taking place. One can be looking at the national minimum wage from ex-post perspective. Countries and places that have already implemented, and people are looking at the data that have been gathered and examining whether national minimum wage, how does it affect employment, how does it affect poverty, inequality, and I think we received a good amount of analysis this morning, across country research on that issue. Another set of research is looking at this from ex-ante perspective, which is basically for a country like here, say, well, what if we introduce national minimum wage? We haven't done it yet. What would be the possibilities? How does it, reverberate into the economy? How does it affect the same issues of whether it's about poverty, inequality, and all the other important indicators in the economy? So what I'm going to present to you is on the category of ex ante, basically looking at the what-if scenario for South Africa, developing several scenarios on national minimum wage, and then using an economic model to simulate for the next 10 years, and then looking at analyzing that. Now, in terms of those who look at also this from the ex-ante perspective, there are different methodology that people use, but one of them is using economic models. But as discussed this morning, the main purpose of the national minimum wage is not that we find a silver bullet to deal with all the problems that we have, but to deal with the poverty inequality. So we need to if we're using a model, we have to use a model that can also give us that kind of results. Look at the impact from the poverty inequality perspective. And there we have a group of models that are basically use macro models, do not deal with the poverty distribution. There's a new class of models last 20, 25 years, which is basically called linked macro-micro model, which is basically linking a macro model to a micro simulation of individuals and households in order to transmit the projection of employment, wages, and prices from the macro into the household model and see the impact of it on poverty inequality. Because at the end of the day, poverty inequality has to take into account the heterogeneity that exists within the household individuals, as Arden was showing us just now. So there are different types of these linked macros exist. A lot of focus became, well, how do we represent households? Do we have a full micro simulation? Do we allow the macro simulation also affect macro, or only coming one way or the other, two-way effects or one-way effect? So there are models that are looking at different types of representing households, using representative households, but a lot of these models also use for the macro, they use CGE models, computable general equilibrium model. And that means basically all the criticism that many of us are familiar with from analytical point of view, from functional specification of the CGE model, from empirical calibration processes, and all the problems that are relating to that is being carried into this link macro-micro, that now you get your poverty inequality effects that are also getting affected by the restrictions and shortcomings of the CGE model. And then CGE model, as we know, is a supply-based model, supply-side model. It's Say's law, supply determine demand. And so that's one group of models that it's predominantly used in many places, CGE linked macro-micro. In South Africa also has been used for that purpose, and is currently being used by Treasury and other places as well. Then, so this group of models with these analytical issues, but also being supply side. Then we had also this morning had a conversation about the ILO model, which is a more on the, basically focuses on the demand side. It's a demand side model, looks at the effects on consumption, on investments, the components of aggregate demand, add them together, aggregate demand is equal to output. So it doesn't have production side, but it focuses on the demand side, determining basically the GDP. But then it doesn't have a micro side to tell you about the poverty inequality. So there is that issue of a micro become issue. So what we have done here is that ADRS has a macro link model, which is not a CGE model. It is not based on calibration. And it is an econometric model of South Africa. And then we have a micro simulation model that we have linked these together, and we have used it for this project. Now I have to learn how to use this. Okay. So I'm going to try to go through this thing quick to get to the so the link macro model that we're going to use has two components, as I mentioned, a macroeconomic model, a micro simulation model, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about these two components and how they come together. As I said, it's for South Africa, try to capture the structure and the complexity of the dynamics within South African economy. The key to understand this model, the projection that we were going to see is and the impact of the national minimum wage is to understand how the model captures production, expenditure, which is demand, and distribution sides of the economy, and the dynamic interactions between these three sides, how it captures that through time series analysis. That is the core. If we understand that a little bit, obviously the paper will elaborate that, explain that better, but this is about the model that has production side, demand side, and distribution side, and these are interact with each other. And to understand how the national minimum wage affects the economy, we have to understand how the dynamic between these three. First, they have the three in there, but then also understand how they are interacting with each other. Now, I'll give you in terms of just quickly about on the production side, if you all know that the GDP is calculated from three different angles, from the expenditure side, from the value added side, production side, and from the factor side, GDP at factor cost. So that's how the model is zooming into the GDP and bring this together. From the production side, it represents the South African economy, where the size of the economy is broken down into 4 primary sectors, 28 manufacturing, and 9 services. And then uses time series analysis, quantification technique to find statistically regression to find determinants of short-term and long-term determinants of sector outputs, 41 sectors of output, and also 41 prices. So those specification allows us those time to find the sensitivities and elasticities that we now and then we talk about each sector of the economy, what affects them, what factors we find are statistically significant in explaining their production side. And the price also by sector is also used, and later on together give you as well the nominal side of the production. So that's from the production. From the expenditure side, the model breaks down the total demand in the economy into its components of aggregate demand, and then use time series analysis to do, again, find determinants of those different components of aggregate demand. So, for example, it has 22 categories of consumption, runs regression analysis to find the determinants of those. Same thing with 41 sectors, investment equations are run, 41 exports, and 38 imports. So those regression analyses are very important because they are the one that we are finding the behavioral relationship. Those are the engine of the model that determines what actually affects them short-term and long-term, and then how they end up being linked together. The similar determinants affecting production sometimes in the distribution, and that creates that simultaneity that exists in the economy. That when we say something, we say that everything seems connected to each other or depends on each other. So, and on the distribution side, which is very important, because we are, especially for the national minimum wage, also the model captures how the economy gets distributed between labor and capital, and also the share of the government. And again, time series analysis are being used for running 45 regressions for the determinants of wage rate for each sector of the economy, and also 41 for determinants of employment. So we have detailed determinations of employment and wage rate in order to find out how wages are being actually determined and what factors affect it, what elasticities, not just the real wage rate affect employment, as it was mentioned earlier this morning. There are other factors in the economy that are affecting employment. And the difference between this model and, for example, CGE model is that we find determinants of, for example, employment. We have to have a statistical support for variables that are included, theoretical understanding of why they are included, rather than just elasticities, educated guess on elasticities. So these are the three different angles from the GDP that, and how it is brought together to this regression analysis. So it's a bottom-up model, because instead of estimating aggregate variables, it goes into at sectoral level. And then the totals, whether it's total manufacturing or total output, come by aggregating the sectors together. And in that sense, it is unique, and I think it makes it very useful for this, especially for the national minimum wage, because it is at sector level. We have to look at how it affects the economy. So I discussed about the sectors of the economy already. So that's basically give you a brief overview of the model. It has about more than 3,200 equations. So there are a lot of accounting scripts that make sure that they are all properly work together and connected together. The variables are connected together. Then this macro model is linked to a household micro simulation model that we have also at ADRS. And that's a full micro simulation model of individual and households. That's about 130,000 individuals, about 30,000 households, and 62,000 families it's made of. And the purpose of it is built, this is more than 10 years ago, it's been built and updated, is basically to look at the impact of government policies on social securities and taxations and EPWP on households and individuals, to look at the project the demand for social securities and the revenue for taxes and others. It is it captures all the different social grants that we have here. The eligibilities and entitlement conditions have been all codified and part of this. The direct and indirect tax, household direct and indirect tax module of the model codes the current taxation program policy of the government and the EPWP. And then it has a module on poverty inequality, and the poverty line that we have used is actually the Statistics South Africa's 960 rand per adult equivalent right now when you see the results. So in terms of how these two models work with each other, the macro model runs, feeds into the macro model, the prices, wages, employment, other variables, and then and the macro side, it estimates, for example, total taxation, total demand cost of social security, and others, indirect taxes, and then others, and feeds it into the macro, and again, macro runs, feeds into the macro, and runs until it converges, the two, the macro and micro. So the flow chart looks like something like this, where you have the detail of your demand, for example, size that we were talking about, your production side, your distribution part of wages and prices, and the growth value added that are being calculated at basic price, market price, and factor cost, and the macro simulation part, where the macro part, the yellow part, feeds into the macro simulation. What happens in the labor market feeds into the household side, determines the demand and supply for the social security, determines the taxations, calculates the net, the household total income, discernment about poverty and inequality, and some of those variables are aggregated and feeded back into the macro side. 10 minutes, okay. So that's we're going to get into the, now we develop 5 scenarios, 4 minimum wage scenarios, and one basically without the scenario. In order to be able to look at the impact of the national minimum wage, we have to have a base scenario that is without the national minimum wage, that we run it for the next 10 years, and then we compare the results from the national minimum wage results to see what the effects of the different scenarios are. So the base scenario is basically we had to make some assumptions and some understanding of what the different policies are and how the South African economy, what would be the growth path of South African economy. Or a base scenario for growth path of the economy, not that actually it would, but something that is realistic. And for that, we made for the base scenario, made a number of assumptions about fiscal policy as we have it here, basically restrictive fiscal policy, monetary policy stays as the inflation targeting. We had government fiscal and financial final consumption expenditures and investments, also what the government has in place, and the poverty line of 930 rand per adult equivalent. These things are explained more in detail in the paper. I'm going to rush because we got a good amount of things to cover. The first scenario, so the first scenario runs basically business as usual scenario. No national minimum wage. We continue as it is. What's the growth path of the economy? What are the effects we get? We simulate the model. The model generates results annually for the next 10 years. Then we say, well, everything has stayed the same. We just introduce one of these national minimum wage scenarios. The first one is basically assuming that the national minimum wage of 2,250 per month in 2016 is being introduced. There's a rationale for that. And then annually after that, it is adjusted by inflation, by 6%. We have added. The second scenario is, we called it the index 40%, which is basically, it's indexed, basically the national minimum wage is indexed to the inflation adjusted average wage for full-time workers, and then every year after that, the first is the 40% of the mean, and then every year, the next 5 years, there will be the next 6 years, 1% added to that 40%. The index goes up by 1% until 2021, which reaches 45%. After that, the 45% stay as it is, and it only adjusts to inflation. The next scenario is the same as 40%. It starts instead by 45%, but it's also looking at the formal sector employee, excluding agriculture and domestic workers. And then it also, after 2001, then 45 reaches to 50%, and then goes up after that by inflation. There are exemptions for agriculture, domestic workers, and the EPWP workers that are also as part of both the index scenarios, which is basically 80% for agriculture, then we have 70% for domestic and EPWP. The maximal scenario is a scenario that begins with 2016 with the 6,000 rand, and then goes up also by a plus 2%, and every year after that it adjusts by inflation plus 2%. After 2021, it only adjusts to inflation, and also it has 3 exemptions for agriculture, domestic workers, and EPWP. I'm not going to go through some of this. The first task we have to look at is that, okay, we have now national minimum wage. There are some exemptions as well in some of the scenarios. Well, how do we start? How do we capture the effects of this? We have to translate the effects of the national minimum wage at each sector. How does it affect the average wage, real wage rate in the sector? Because the model, the 45 estimated wage rates are average real wage rate in each sector. So we have to say, if one of these scenarios are in place, how does the average wage rate in each sector gets affected, the shocked, and then let that shock transmit into the rest of the economy. Oh, no. Now, the wages that we have basically for the next 10 years, these are the scenarios. The nominal wage rate basically increases between 6 and 8.42% from 2016 to 2025 from national agriculture, domestic workers, and EPWP. They are differentiated, as you can see. The vertical axes are exactly the same, so you can see also the magnitudes are very different in terms of how it evolves in nominal terms. In real terms, obviously, when you take the inflation out, the average increase per year is between 0 and 2.28%. The 0 is for the minimal scenario because it was just adjusting after 2016 to inflation. So when you take the inflation out, it's not increasing in real terms. So it gives you a sense of the magnitude when we're talking about the national minimum wage and its shock to the economy. And Alan pointed that out this morning, and I think it's very important. We have to realize what the magnitude of these shocks are. It's not, it's different from individuals who are specific sector, but when we're looking at the average wage rate, real wage rate in the sector, how much it gets shocked, it's shocked between 0 and 228 under these 4 scenarios. This is designed for you not to see it, but no, but this, what it does is it provides, it tells you how much is the shock to each sector under each scenario. And again, on the average, what you find is that the average of the initial shock, 2016 shock, to the average real wage rate is between 0.27% and 2.16%. So different sectors get affected differently, shocked differently, their average wage rates, and it is that range that the average wage in the sectors are getting affected. So that's very important in terms of the understanding the overall. So as a result of this shock for the different scenarios, obviously the average wages now the model simulates. It has partly the model determine wage rates by itself, but then also it adjusts for the portion of the workers that are below minimum wage, adjust their wage. And as you can see, the first lines that you see are the business as usual. These ones are business as usual. And then you'll see under the 3 scenarios how the average monthly rate increases between 2016 and 2025. Now, we have the wages going up, and what you find also is that we have about 4 million and more people, workers, full-time workers, that are going to be affected by the national minimum wage, the initial national minimum wage of like about 4 million and more, less than 3,000 rand per month. So that magnitude is important because when their income is getting adjusted, then right away you see also the effects on household income. This is real household income, average annual growth rate. So this is the base scenario without the national minimum wage, and you can see that it is the average annual growth rate increases as a result of the introduction of the national minimum wage. And that has repercussion from the income, from the expenditure side of the model, where you see now from, on the one side, the demand for Social Security. On the macro side, you find that by 2025, as a result of the introduction of the national minimum wage, there will be a less, the minimal scenario, about a 1% less demand for Social Security, total demand for Social Security, and you can see the other scenarios reduces because the incomes are going up and the Social Security is means tested. 2 minutes. Okay. Taxes got to be, revenue from taxes go up, income goes up. We estimate how much taxes are being affected. This is again percentage difference from the business as usual, comparing, saying how its scenarios affect revenue income. The projections are annual, and obviously income has gone up, the consumption also gradually go up, and these are the scenarios real household consumption expenditure between 2015 and 2025 under each scenario. The bottom one is the business as usual, and the other ones are with the national minimum wage. At each of them, because of the impact on income, it affects consumption. And also the model also what the consumption means in terms of demand for different categories of consumption is also we know, as you can see, what percentage is percentage growth in it and the business as usual, and how it affects it in the with business with the national minimum wage. Investment, the trend is growing trend, but with the national minimum wage, the average annual growth rate of investment is about is either similar or about 0.4% lower, and that's a very interesting results. Explanation of it comes from what is happening with the national minimum wage and the productivity and the capital labor ratio, which I come back if you allow me, because you can't go without knowing that aspect. Exports and imports, both the exports goes up, and part of the reason for exports going up, this is different from this morning's results, is that the productivity increase in the results of the productivity increase because of the national minimum wage, it also has a effect on prices. Rising productivity lowers prices, and we have that's an estimated for our price equations. They all are affected by mostly by labor productivity, and that helps the competitiveness of South African economy. Imports go up because obviously income has gone up, consumption has gone up, and that increases imports. So you have both the imports and exports going up. In some cases, the gap is getting smaller. In some cases, getting bigger. That's, we leave that for now. Now, in terms of production side, that was basically the components of aggregate demand. You have there, and then in terms of the national minimum wage, the average real growth rate, the annual growth rate, the base scenario, the business as usual, 2.42. That's the no national minimum wage. And you can see that it has a positive effect. The national minimum wage has a positive effect, small, a little larger, and 0.4 to 0.6 or so, and on the growth of the economy. You can see that in terms of the trend annually. And here also you see it from the manufacturing, from breaking down into the aggregate sectors. The primary sector actually output goes up, mainly because of its effects from the manufacturing sector demand. Also, the interlinkages to the primary sector also helps primary sector grow. These percentages are not percentage growth rate. These are percentage change relative to the business as usual. So if the manufacturing goes up in business as usual by 2%, and here it says it goes up 5.1% above that, that means it goes up by 2.1% in the next scenario. So that's percentage growth relative to the business as usual. In the service sector, we're estimating that the output goes down, except for the last scenario, but the overall economy, the total output effects on the total output of the economy is positive with the four different scenarios relative to the business as usual. Grow faster and has positive effect. Employment effect on the primary sector and the manufacturing sector are positive. Again, these are percentage increase relative to the business as usual. On the service sector, we have a small decline of relative to the business as usual, and there is basically affecting also the overall effect of the economy, a small difference, a small decline on the total employment. This is declining somewhere between, I want to just to make sure the magnitude is also understood, is basically we're estimating between like 43,000, 30,000 to 16,000 to about 45,000 total decline, which is actually similar to some of the other studies as well, where they overestimate when you take their overestimation of its effect on domestic workers into account. Unemployment rate, business as usual, 25.2 estimations. It goes up because of that the employment effect that we just talked about, decline about 0.2% the maximum, depending on the scenario, higher. Now, the capital, this is an important part in terms of the efficiency wage, that the rise in the national minimum wage help the labor productivity goes up, is also not only labor productivity, but also the capital productivity goes up, and the combination of the two also help you having a lower capital labor ratio as a result of this change. And that means the capitalization of the production goes down some. It is basically it incentivizes the producers to also use their efficiency, that is their higher productivity, to expand production, not just from increasing the capital investment. I know I'm going very fast. With the inflation effect that the labor productivity decline, increasing as a result of the one we were seeing now, has its impact on the inflation. Pretty much not a major difference, but there is a small decline as a result of in some of the scenarios. Debt GDP ratios more or less within the range, acceptable range. Inequality, we're coming to the end. 1 minute. The inequality, it is the effects of it on overall inequality estimated. This is for 2020. When you run the model for 10 years, in 10 years, what's the inequality, business as usual, and what's the inequality and the different scenarios? Basically, what we estimated is about 66.4 for the Gini index, and it is 0.5% or up to about 1.2, 1.3% lower inequality. In other words, the national minimum wage reduces inequality, income inequality. In terms of poverty, we estimate that by 2025, the same. What is the poverty rate in 2025 and the business as usual? We have it here, 29.3, and then gradually coming down under different scenarios now, having it lower by 2% or up to 3% lower poverty effect. But the poverty effect of it is more significant when you go to, I'm going to just skip some of these gender effects to look at it from the quantile. The effects of the national minimum wage on poverty when you're looking at the poverty from quantile. If you look at the fourth quantile, you'll see more or less not much change in terms of poverty rate between the base scenario and the other scenarios. But look at the bottom quantile, where the poverty rate of 2025, 60.6% from the business as usual to 50, 51%, like around between 10%, 0 to 10% lower poverty rate. In other words, that national minimum wage that are gearing toward the lower, the poor, the working poor, which are basically concentrated on the bottom quantile. The bottom quantile, the poverty rate is picked up clearly the main beneficiary. So here's the conclusion. Overall, national minimum wage South Africa, we find it to be poor measure that reduces poverty and inequality and improves economic growth. We think that the suitable approach to measure the potential impact of national minimum wage takes account of the dynamic interactions between expenditure, production, and distribution. The introduction of the national minimum wage and the subsequent wage adjustments of 48% and more full-time workers across sectors of the economy help increase the average wage, sector wage rate from below. And that's very important. That is different from the trends in increase in the sector average wage from the increase in income of the high-skilled workers, what we have had. So this is, average wages are going up from the bottom. And that's, important that from national minimum wage. Similarly, the contribution of a national minimum wage to increase in total household income mainly reflects its positive impact on the income of the working poor and not to an increase in the income of the high income earners. Because when you look at the remuneration in the national income account, it's the remuneration of everyone, from the poor to the non-poor household. But here is, when the income is going up now, or we're seeing average wage going up, it is coming from basically increasing the share of the working poor. And the model results show that the introduction of national minimum wage will predominantly have positive impact on key macroeconomic and industry indicators. At the same time, introduction of the policy is projected to significantly reduce headcount poverty, especially among the bottom quintile, and to reduce income inequality. Its projected positive impact on household income and expenditure is also projected to reduce demand for social grants and increase government revenue from taxation. The negative effects of introducing a meaningful national minimum wage on some economic indicators do not threaten macroeconomic balance. And they may be therefore considered acceptable trade-off. Like we were saying, of the unemployment rate of going down by 0.2% or so. When we looking at it as 60%, 60,000, 30,000 people losing job, as opposed to 4 million and more people income going up. This is, we got to have a sense of the magnitude. We're looking at the loss, we're not looking at the gains and then the same number of, and that's important. And the projected positive contribution of national minimum wage to economic growth indicate that it can help the economy break away from the current vicious circle of low growth path. Thank you very much. Sorry I took too long.